developmental banks, cryptocurrencies, financial inclusion, and much more. Now, the Delhi Declaration also highlighted its commitment on reducing the gap between men and women's labour force participation by 25% by 2025. Parikshit Luthara spoke to Richard Samans, International Labour Organization's G20 Sherpa, and started by asking about the key achievements from this G20 summit.
I think the declaration that was released today was significant and helpful to working people on a number of fronts. So the answer to your question is yes, important steps were taken forward here. As always, the G20 works in incremental ways, typically. And so I would say that there's some significant outcomes in relation to the agreement on a set of policy priorities for extending social protection to gig and platform economy workers, which who in many countries are not covered well by social security systems. And so an agreement around a set of, you might call it a policy roadmap, a series of actions that countries can pick and choose from, but with an agreed, aligned purpose to make sure that those workers, even if they're not formal salaried employees, nonetheless are covered by basic social security protections or more, is a good step forward. Right. Secondly, on gender, there was a explicit review of how countries are doing on the so-called Brisbane goal that was set by the G20 about 8 or 9 years ago to improve women's participation in the labor force by 25% by the year 2025. And they reauthorized our mandate, the ILO's mandate, along with the OECD, to monitor and report on country progress in this regard.
Right. I would also like to ask you, when you speak about gig workers, there have been issues that gig workers have been facing across the world. We have seen agitations also by them. But are there certain jurisdictions, certain countries which you are actually monitoring for the plight of gig workers or the conditions of gig workers?
We're currently undertaking an international review of policies in respect of platform economy workers in preparation for a standard-setting discussion that we will have in the organization in 2025 and 2026. We were recently mandated by our governing body and by the International Labor Conference, which is all of the constituencies of the ILO, to prepare that very important standard-setting process. And so, yes, in order to prepare well for that, to provide a good base of information for governments, workers' organizations, and employers' organizations who will be participating in those discussions, we are conducting quite a bit of analysis globally.
Right. Now, when it comes to issues related to labor and unemployment, are there certain issues that you brought before the G20 to highlight the importance of these issues, the extent of the problems across countries?
Yes, as is the case typically in the G20, early in the process, the international organizations are asked to provide some analysis and latest statistics on the state of play. And so we, like other years, provided technical papers into the group, and these form the basis for the decision-making by the governments on which agenda items they wanted to prioritize. So yes, we played a role in that. I would just say in this regard that the Indian government placed, right from the very beginning, a big emphasis on skills. And not only investing in skills and improving skills in development in many ways, and indeed this declaration endorses a set of policy priorities, again, another policy roadmap for how countries can do that. But it also tasked the ILO and the OECD to fill out a global skills database, jobs database that we have. We call it Skills for Jobs, to all of the G20 countries so that there is some latest and comparable information to enable countries to modernize and sharpen their skilling strategies.
Right. So this will be to plug the gaps when it comes to skills in the workforce.
Yes.
Now, when we look at the Indian economy, any recommendations you have specifically to the workforce in India, labor issues in India that you'd like to highlight?
We do have an active, supportive relationship here with your government and with the involvement of workers and employers organizations. We provide a range of technical assistance in several respects. So we provide that advice based on analysis and evidence, if you will. And I would simply say that in this regard, that one of the most impressive ways the Indian government projected the Indian development experience to the rest of the world, to the rest of the G20, was by highlighting the strides forward that have been made with the digital public infrastructure here. And that has implications for the world of work, for the work that we do, in that it makes it more feasible to reach more workers with, for example, Social Security, social protection benefits, if you will. So one of the recommendations we make to lots of governments, which are still in the process of extending and deepening the coverage of various benefits, applies here as well. India has some ways to go, but it's enabling that progress with technology in ways that are quite impressive. And I think we would just salute the leadership of the government here in putting this on the agenda as an important priority this year.
Right. The text of the declaration also speaks about the importance of DPI and financial inclusion, and this will be discussed forward as well. Any areas when it comes to plugging the gender gap in the workforce or equal opportunities, are there any areas that India needs to work on as far as its workforce, as far as its labor standards go?
Well, you have still a recent set of labor codes that were enacted in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and so now there's a great focus on implementation of that. And so I think the general advice that we would provide is to take that process very seriously, and just as there needed to be quite a bit of consultation, what we call social dialogue among the key social partners in the preparation of the legislation, so there needs to be a concerted focus and consultation on ensuring that it's implemented widely and consistently across the country. And there are different dimensions of those codes. And sometimes they're interdependent, and therefore there's a need for a certain degree of consistency among them. And I know that that's an important area that deserves focus. The other thing I would say, that in many respects a human-centered approach to the future of work is about increasing investment in people, increasing investment in their skills, their protections, their labor protections, as well as their social protection benefits, if you will. And so for India, a big part of the challenge is to sustain an ongoing increase in investment in its people in these various dimensions, because it's by doing all of them that you get a virtuous circle of improved access to opportunity, improved productivity, higher incomes and living standards among the population.
Right.
And I would say that this is understood as a priority in the country, but it's always important for an organization like ours to offer our support for continuing that process and to make technical assistance available, which we very happily do here.
All right. My final question would be on how consensus was actually achieved. When you stepped into meetings yesterday morning, was there consensus, or do you feel that it was the leaders who actually pulled it off at the last moment? How did it all come about?
Well, I think you have to ask your diplomats here how they pulled it off, but it was there were pieces that were undecided until the last couple of days of the Sherpa negotiations this week, and indeed coming into the night before last. But as I understand it, your government led a very creative and effective diplomatic process to utilize some of the leading actors in the G20 this year, which is the Troika governments, plus South Africa, which will be in 2 years' time the president, to craft a text that was able to be provided to both of the protagonists in the larger debates about the Ukraine war in a way that found consensus. And that's a significant diplomatic accomplishment that I think will be viewed in history as quite a contribution to maintaining the forward motion of the G20 process, where a lot of commentators, including here as I watched the news in the days and weeks coming up to the summit, thought that this was going to be a major test for the G20.
But didn't you feel at some point that it would be difficult to have consensus? Was everyone actually, that would be my question, was eventually everyone happy with the wording on the Russia-Ukraine war? Russia was named only once. Words like deploring the war, condemning the war, they were removed. Was everyone satisfied?
I'm not in a position to say. I think you'd have to ask the parties directly on that.
Well, with that, it's time now to slip into a very short break, but we've been in conversation